it's Jared with Gear and Light. Today we're going to talk about the top 7 settings to change on your GoPro Hero 10 for video. Now, I've done this video in the past for older versions of the GoPro. With the Hero 10, there are some changes. Of course, some of them were pretty consistent with the Hero 9, but some of the settings and the options have changed, and so I wanted to do an updated video and talk about the video settings that I change here to get the best video that I can out of this GoPro. So I use my GoPros for a variety of different things. Lately, I've been using it a lot for documenting my process of getting my private pilot's license, and so I've been mounting them inside of small airplanes and stuff like that. But I also use GoPros to mount on my cameras for behind the scenes footage. I use them when we go out and do stuff as a family, like kayaking or hiking or something like that. And so the idea of learning how to set these custom settings in the camera so that we get the best footage is pretty important. GoPro has really dialed these cameras in, and they do a pretty good job if you just let them go, set everything to auto. But there are situations where your footage is not going to stand out in compared to other people who understand how to set these settings and customize their GoPro. So we're going to walk through that together today. So I'm going to go ahead and power on my GoPro Hero 10, and we're going to take a look at the settings that I change. So the first thing that I want to do is go and set the mode here from 4K 24. Actually, by default, I think it comes, the standard is 4K 30. So when it comes to your resolution and your frame rate, you want to set this based on what you're trying to achieve. The GoPro has the ability to shoot higher resolution than 4K. It will actually shoot 5.3K. And so if you go into 5.3K, you can go up to 60p and of course 30p and 24p. But in 5.3K, you can only shoot in either 60 or 30. So what 5.3K allows you to do is have a larger image than what you're actually going to need. Now, we're probably going to create most of our videos either in 4K or perhaps 1080p. And so having this additional resolution allows us to crop in a little bit. And with a GoPro that doesn't really have good zoom, the only way to really zoom into something is to get closer to it, then this becomes useful because we can then crop in a little bit just like we would on a photo and not lose any detail. So 5.3K is a great option for that. It does tax your battery life a little bit. So if you want something that's going to work for both better battery life performance and still give you a little bit of extra resolution, you might just want to shoot in 4K, and I tend to go with 24p. The only reason that I would shoot in something other than 24p is if I was wanting to slow down and use slow motion. And so what I typically do for that is just have my different video shooting modes. I've got standard set to 4K 24 wide. I've got activity set to 4K 120 wide, and then I just leave cinematic where it's at. Sometimes I'll even go and just change on my other GoPros. I've changed this to 30 because I don't need the 60p in most scenarios. And so I have those 3 different shooting modes, and of course you can create additional shooting modes as well to make it easy to jump in and out of these different shooting modes. But most of the time I'm shooting in 4K 24. If I know that I'm going to need to crop in a little bit, I will jump up to that 5.3K. Now let's go a bit deeper into the settings, and these are customizable for each of these video modes that you can save. I'm going to click on the little pen icon, and I'm going to swipe down here to Pro Tune. Now in Pro Tune there are some different settings that you can adjust. The first one that I'm going to set is the ISO minimum and maximum. You can see I have those set to 100 and 800. That is going to allow the camera to automatically adjust the ISO between 100 and 800 as the camera sees fit. The ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor, and that means that in lower light situations, the camera is able to boost its sensitivity a little bit to allow more light and to brighten up the scene. Now, I set these limitations here because I don't want the camera to boost the sensitivity as high as it possibly can. As you can see, it can go much higher than 800. It can go all the way up to 6400. And the problem with allowing the camera to go up that high is that the image is going to become noisy and grainy at those higher sensitivities. The camera small sensor is not really designed to be pushed that far. And so in those darker situations, low light situations, when it boosts the ISO like that, you're going to have graininess and artifacting in your image, and you're just going to be wondering why you're not able to get great images. Now, there are going to be situations where you have to push it as hard as possible because you're not going to get any shot at all otherwise, and that's okay. You can go and manually make the changes temporarily. But in most situations, I do not want the camera going above ISO 800, and so I set the minimum at the lowest and I set the maximum at ISO 800. Let's talk about shutter speed. You can set the shutter speed of this camera from auto and go, pretty much in anywhere in this range here. And what this allows you to do is increase or decrease the amount of light. You can see here that as I go up to 1:384, it gets darker, and as I go lower, it gets brighter. Now, in situations where the lighting may be changing a little bit and you're not able to make sure that the scene that you're shooting is staying super consistent, you could just set this to auto and the camera is going to fluctuate the shutter speed based on what it needs to do to keep your scene exposed properly. Now, the problem with this is that it is going to make changes to your exposure. So if there are temporary moments of, a little bit of change in the light, the camera is going to change the shutter speed to try and expose and keep things properly exposed. You might not want that in all situations, but if you do, I recommend just setting the shutter speed to auto. In situations where you want to control that, you just want to make sure that your shutter speed is set to double that of the frame rate. So if we're shooting at 24p, then 48 is an appropriate shutter. If we're shooting at 120p for slow motion, then we want to make sure that we are at least at 120, which means going up to probably 192. If we stay below 192, perhaps at 196, then we're running into issues. We're not doubling the frame rate. That is the standard rule with cameras, is that the frame rate, the shutter speed needs to be double that of the frame rate. And there may be instances, if you shoot in auto, that the camera goes down below what you need for that frame rate. And so there might be an instance, even shooting at 24, that the camera decides to go down to 124, which is not double that of the frame rate. So in most situations, I try to set the shutter to something that is at least double that of the frame rate. In a brighter situation outside, it's going to be very hard to shoot at 1/48 of a shutter. You will definitely need an ND filter, something like this, that is going to limit the amount of light that comes through. You can easily remove these by twisting them, and they pop right off, like so. And then you can add an ND filter. I'll link to the ones that I use down below, and I also soon have a comparison video coming out soon of the different ND filters, because there are a lot of different ND filters. Some of them are expensive, some of them are not, and so I have a video coming out soon that is comparing them. So you'll notice that when I have the shutter set, I cannot change the exposure value compensation. When I have it set to auto, I can set the exposure value compensation. And so when I'm shooting in auto, I always set the EV comp to -1. Now, the reason I set it to -1 is because often the GoPro is overexposing the brighter areas of the scene and I'm losing detail. On cameras like this, I would rather underexpose a little bit and bring back some brightness to the areas that need it than be stuck with an image that is overexposed and then trying to bring back detail. It's always easier to bring back detail in the shadows than it is to bring back detail in the highlights. When the highlights are clipped, which means they are pure white, there's no detail left that you can get out of them. So I typically go with -1 because that brings the exposure down just a little bit, one stop, and it allows for those highlight areas to retain their detail, and then I can add a little bit of exposure, even add a little bit of selective exposure back in post-production. Setting a custom white balance is also pretty important on a GoPro. You can see that I have the white balance set to 5500. The GoPro has different white balance. It also has an auto, and what's called a native, but it has exposure values that I can set as I adjust the slider. Typically I'm shooting outside and there's some sort of brightness out, like the sun, and it's not a super cloudy or overcast day, so I set the white balance to 5500. What is expected from the sun is around 5600 Kelvin. This camera allows you to set to 5500, which is very, very close. So I set all of my GoPros to 5500 so that there is not any color shift. What happens when you set your white balance to auto is that as the GoPro is metering the different colors that are out there, it is adjusting that white balance automatically. And so if you end up with a little bit more of a temporary shadow or something in the background that has a different color value, the GoPro may try and actually change that white balance to something else. And then when that thing exits the scene, the white balance changes back to maybe where it was, or maybe not back to where it was. And then you end up with an image that has inconsistent color. Always set your white balance to a fixed mode, like a 5500 for outdoors. You can slide it down to cool it off if you're indoors and maybe you have some older style light bulbs that are just very warm. What you want to do is just have what looks best to you and then make that consistent across everything that you're shooting with. I'm using multiple GoPros often. I'm also using GoPros in conjunction with footage from other cameras, and so I want to have the white balance set to be consistent between all of those cameras, which means that when I switch from one camera view to another in the video that I'm creating, it doesn't seem weird. There isn't like a weird color change that throws everybody off, and now they're wondering like what happened. When you change from one camera to another, you should notice the scene change, but you should not notice things like color shifting and stuff like that. So you want to set your custom white balance to a specific number, a temperature that matches your environment. And a lot of times it does just come down to making adjustments here and deciding what is the closest. On even a cloudy day, it's not going to be 5500K. I may decide to warm it up a little bit because maybe it's a little cooler out. Or if I'm going for something a little more moody, I may bring the blue tones in a little bit by decreasing that number just to give that effect. To get the highest quality footage out of your camera, you'll want to make sure to set the bitrate to high. There is a standard and a high option, and that is basically it. What it's going to do is boost the bitrate to 100 megabits per second, and this is only for the 2.7K and up resolutions, but this is for optimal image quality. So if you're shooting in anything above 1080p, I highly recommend setting your bitrate to high. You're going to get better quality footage, and that means when you go to edit it, the ability to change the colors or color correct it or do anything like that, you're going to have a lot more data to work with in that image, and it's going to provide a better overall opportunity for you to make those changes because the footage is not so compressed. Scrolling down a little bit, we have sharpness. Sharpness is something that GoPro adds in to a lot of their footage to help with the fact that these tiny little sensors are trying to get the most epic image possible. Now the problem with adding in sharpness is that there's no way to unadd or remove sharpness once it's added. I would rather control the sharpness by managing that in post-production. When I'm editing in Final Cut Pro or whatever app I'm using, I will add a little bit of sharpness to make that consistent with the other footage that I have that I'm putting into this project. So if I have multiple GoPros and other cameras, I don't want a GoPro to have this oddly sharpened footage that just doesn't seem super realistic when my other cameras are not producing that footage. So I would rather have this set to low, and there are options here for medium and high. So low is as low as we can get, and that's the amount of sharpness that I will add with the camera. Next, I changed the color to flat. There are two different options here besides that. There's vibrant, there's neutral, and there's flat. Changing the color to flat means that GoPro is not over-exaggerating those colors. A lot of times this GoPro and all GoPros will boost the blues in the sky beyond any, it's not even realistic, the way that GoPro changes these colors sometimes. I want control over that. When those colors are being artificially changed in the camera using software, it's really hard to make changes and pull that out and make things look a little bit more realistic or match those things with other cameras. I would rather add the color correction in post-production than do it in camera, so I recommend setting the color to flat. At the worst, set it to neutral. Vibrant is way over the top, and I don't recommend utilizing that at all. Now, even though the GoPro only has one lens on it, it has the ability to set different fields of view, which are crops. They call them different lenses, but they're not. They're just different crops. And you have everything from super view all the way down to narrow, and you basically want to set this based on what you're trying to achieve. Some of these do not work with different resolutions, and so if you're shooting in the highest resolution 5.3K, you're going to be very limited into the options that you get here. Most of the time I am shooting in wide. I don't very often go to super view unless I'm trying to fit a lot into that scene. Wide is the setting that I most often use, and it is kind of the default or native field of view for the GoPro. Some of these other views might become useful, but a lot of these are cropped in features, and so I would only use these if the situation warrants it. But keep in mind that you are cropping in using software, which means you're losing resolution when you are shooting in some of these modes, which is why some of them are not available in the higher resolution modes like 5.3K, because if you're shooting in 5.3K, there is not enough leftover resolution for the camera to crop in itself. So I recommend using either wide or perhaps super view if you need it, but only use these crop in modes if you absolutely need it for something that you're trying to achieve. And keep in mind that you're going to lose the ability to use some of those high resolution settings like 5.3K. All right, so some bonus tips for shooting video with a GoPro. You're gonna wanna use modern micro SD cards. I've recently upgraded all of my cards to V30 or V60 cards. This new rating or newer rating of V30, V60, V90 is a rating that helps you choose the appropriate card based on what you're trying to film. With the GoPro, I have tested a V30 card shooting in high bitrate 5.3K, basically the biggest file that the GoPro is able to achieve, and the V30 cards seem to work pretty well. Haven't had any issues with it stopping recording or issues with it not being able to record because the card is not fast enough for the camera to write to. A V60 card is going to see you a little bit into the future. Utilizing a V60 card, you'll probably be able to utilize that card on at least the next version, the GoPro Hero 11, maybe even the 12. If you're wanting cards that are just extremely fast, that are going to be much more future-proof, you can go with the V90 cards, but the V90 cards are very expensive and definitely not needed for shooting on a GoPro at this time. Those would be cards that we're going to need when we get to the world of 8K with our GoPro cameras. With your SD cards, when you put them in, the first thing that you want to do, after of course making sure that you've backed up anything that's on that SD card, is go into Preferences, scroll down to Reset, and format that SD card and hit Format. You may use your micro SD cards in other devices such as drones or even your smartphone, and you want to make sure that you're formatting that card in the GoPro because the GoPro file format and the way that the GoPro writes footage to the card, you want to make sure that formatting is where it begins. Utilizing a card that was formatted by your computer or by another device may result in issues with writing data to that card. It may not, but you don't want to risk it. So I always start out a session with a GoPro by formatting the card that's in the camera so that I have a fresh format, and I'm starting with a card that was formatted with the GoPro that I'm using that card in. Now, earlier I talked about ND filters. ND filters are super useful for GoPros in most situations. The ND filters are going to limit the amount of light that the sensor is able to see, and that allows the shutter speed to come down a bit on your camera so that your footage looks more natural. When the shutter speed is boosted really high, the footage becomes a little surreal looking and just doesn't seem natural to the eye. So we want to get that shutter speed down a bit. Especially if you have fast movement and things happening. With the higher shutter speeds, you get a rolling shutter effect where things seem to be tilted or maybe even a little warped as they come through the scene. So you want to slow down that shutter speed if at all possible, and using an ND filter set is definitely going to help out. This particular set right here is a Polar Pro set. I'll link to a couple of them down in the description below. And I also mentioned a video that's upcoming, which is a comparison of the different ND filter sets. And so make sure to subscribe to the channel so you're notified when that comes out. ND filter sets come in different strengths, like an ND8, ND16, and ND32 are pretty standard for the GoPros, and as the number gets higher, it limits more light, and so depending on the situation and how bright it is outside, you might try using different ND filters. They're very easy to remove and replace, but I do not recommend using them underwater where you're submerging your GoPro, as the quality of those ND filters and the seal and everything, I just don't completely trust taking a camera underwater. In underwater situations, you most likely don't need to limit the amount of light. So usually using ND filters only in situations where I'm above where I'm above sea level or above lake level and not submerging my GoPro. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier, don't shoot in 120p unless you need it. It's great that the camera can shoot in 120p, but shooting in 4K 120 when you don't need to slow your footage down to get that slow motion is simply wasting your battery and wasting storage space. So just because it can shoot in 4K 120 doesn't mean you have to. Most of the time I'm shooting in 4K 24p because that's what I need, and I don't need anything higher than that. So don't shoot in 120p just because you have the ability. Consider a different frame rate just for saving size and improving battery life. Those are important things when it comes to utilizing GoPros for filming. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope that these settings helped out and that you were able to understand a little bit more about how they work. It's kind of hard to explain some of these more kind of pro type of concepts if you're getting started. You definitely can get lost at times in some of these things. If you want to understand manual mode better, I have a Ditch Auto course which helps you get out of automatic mode and learn how to shoot in manual. Right now, that is a camera specific course, not GoPro specific, but I am working on additional courses that are more specific to GoPro and video shooting. The concepts learned in the course are still pretty much the same. You just have to understand that a GoPro is a bit different than a traditional style DSLR or mirrorless camera. But the course is still useful, and you can get that course for free down in the description below. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks so much for checking it out. Give it a thumbs up and click that subscribe button to be notified when I put out new ones. Until next time, take care.